The woman beneath this burning wagon shouldn't have been alive, blood soaked through silk that cost more than most men earned in a year. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as flames licked at the splintered wood above her head. Gideon Hale had seen death enough times to recognize it approaching, but something in her defiant grip on consciousness made him move. He pulled her from the wreckage just as the wagon collapsed into ash. She opened her eyes once, saw his weathered face, and whispered a single word before darkness took her. Don't. He didn't know yet whether she meant don't leave me or don't ask questions. On the frontier, both were often the same request. If you want to see how far this story travels across the world, drop a comment below with your city. And if you're still here at the end, hit that like button. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of dried grass the color of old leather beneath a merciless August sun. Gideon Hale rode through it with the mechanical rhythm of a man who had forgotten how to feel the passing of time. His horse, a gray mare named Prudence, picked her way across the uneven ground with the careful deliberation of an animal that knew her rider's attention often wandered to darker places. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah's cough had turned from nuisance to nightmare, since the doctor from Fort Collins had shaken his head and taken Gideon's money anyway, since he dug a grave on the hillside overlooking their cabin and stood before it unable to speak the words everyone expected. The preacher had done it instead, and Gideon had stood there like a fence post, dry-eyed and hollow, wondering distantly when he'd feel something again. He hadn't yet. The cabin still stood in the foothills where they'd built it together, logs chinked with mud and hope, a stone chimney Sarah had insisted would make it feel like a real home. Gideon lived there now the way a ghost haunts a house, occupying space without truly inhabiting it. He ate when hunger became impossible to ignore, slept when exhaustion dragged him down, and rode the prairie when the silence of the cabin pressed too hard against his chest. Today he'd ridden farther than usual, following nothing in particular, when he first smelled the smoke. It wasn't the clean scent of a campfire, or the acrid bite of prairie grass burning in the natural way lightning sometimes ignited it. This smoke carried something heavier, burned canvas, scorched wood, and beneath it all, something that made Prudence toss her head nervously. Gideon's hand moved to the rifle in his saddle holster without conscious thought. 3 years of isolation hadn't dulled the instincts learned from 6 years before that, when he'd worn cavalry blue and learned that the frontier killed the careless first. He crested a low rise and saw the wreckage spread across the shallow valley below. 3 wagons, or what remained of them. 2 had burned completely, their canvas covers reduced to skeletal ribs of charred wood reaching toward the sky like the fingers of drowning men. The 3rd had tipped onto its side, one wheel shattered, the other still slowly spinning in the wind. Supplies were scattered everywhere, broken crates, torn sacks of flour painting the dirt white, a child's doll lying face down in the dust. No bodies. Not immediately visible anyway. Gideon sat Prudence for a long moment, every sense alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The raiders, and they had been raiders, no question about that, could still be near, but the tracks he could see even from this distance looked at least a day old, maybe 2. The spinning wheel would have stopped by now if the attack had been recent. He nudged Prudence forward carefully, rifle across his lap, eyes constantly moving. The first body he found was a man, middle-aged, lying 20 feet from the nearest wagon with an arrow still lodged in his back. His hands were empty. He'd never even reached for a weapon. Gideon had seen this before, the way civilians froze when violence erupted, their minds unable to shift from the peaceful routine of travel to the sudden reality of death rushing toward them. A woman lay near the overturned wagon, younger than the man, her dress torn. Gideon looked once, long enough to confirm she was beyond help, then looked away. Some things didn't need closer examination. He counted 5 more bodies as he worked his way through the wreckage. A family, maybe 2 families, traveling together for safety. That safety had been an illusion. The raiders had hit fast and hard, probably just after dawn when people were still shaking off sleep, brewing coffee, thinking about the day's travel ahead. The smallest body made him stop. A boy, maybe 8 years old, clutching a wooden horse carved with the careful imprecision of a father's hands. Gideon knelt beside him for a moment, not praying, he'd lost the habit of that, but simply acknowledging the waste of it. The boy should have grown up, should have learned to carve his own horses, should have had the chance to lose everything the way Gideon had instead of losing it all before he'd had anything. He was turning away, already composing in his mind the report he'd have to file with the territorial marshal, 2 days' hard ride to the nearest outpost, when Prudence nickered sharply. The mare was staring at the overturned wagon, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Gideon's rifle came up smoothly, the stock finding his shoulder with practiced ease. He approached the wagon from an angle, keeping his sight lines clear, finger resting along the trigger guard but not yet on the trigger itself. Could be a raider left behind injured, could be an animal drawn by the smell, could be movement. Beneath the wagon's undercarriage, hidden in the shadow cast by the tilted bed, something dark pressed against the far wheel. "Come out slow," Gideon said, his voice rough from disuse. "Hands where I can see them." No response, but the shadow shifted slightly. Definitely a person, definitely still alive. "I'm not with whoever did this," Gideon continued, keeping his rifle trained on the shadow. "But I will shoot if you make me nervous. Come out. Now." A hand emerged first, pale fingers splayed against the dirt. Then an arm wrapped in fabric that might have once been fine, but was now torn and stained. Then a face, a woman's face, framed by dark hair matted with blood and dust. She looked at him with eyes that were neither pleading nor afraid, but simply empty, as if she'd already accepted whatever came next and found she didn't particularly care which way it went. "Are you—" Gideon started to ask if she was hurt, then saw the blood soaking through the left side of her dress, dark and wet despite the hours that must have passed. "Never mind. Don't move." He dismounted quickly, looping Prudence's reins around a piece of broken wagon tongue, and approached the woman with his rifle still ready but pointed slightly away. As he got closer, he could see she wasn't young, mid-30s maybe, but carried herself with a posture that spoke of a life very different from the frontier. Even collapsed in the dirt, half dead beneath a destroyed wagon, there was something refined about the way she held her head, the bone structure of her face, the way her fingers remained gracefully positioned despite their trembling. "I'm going to check the wound," Gideon said, kneeling beside her. "Tell me if you're hurt anywhere else." "Don't." Her voice was barely a whisper, but firm. "Don't what? Don't help you? You'll be dead by sundown without—" "Don't ask questions." She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. "Please." Gideon paused, studying her face. There was a story there, obviously. These wagons hadn't been carrying ordinary settlers. The quality of her dress alone, even destroyed as it was, spoke of money. Real money. The kind that didn't usually end up crossing the prairie in a canvas-covered wagon without military escort. But he'd meant what he said about not being with the raiders. And more than that, he recognized something in her eyes. The same thing he saw in his own reflection on the rare occasions he bothered to look. Someone who'd already survived the worst thing they could imagine and found the world kept demanding they survive more. "All right," he said quietly. "No questions." He examined the wound as gently as he could. A bullet had torn through her left side, high enough that it might have missed the vital organs, but she'd lost a lot of blood. The fact that she was conscious at all spoke to either remarkable constitution or sheer stubborn will. Probably both. "I have a cabin about 3 hours' ride north," Gideon said, already pulling bandaging from his saddlebag. He'd learned to carry medical supplies after Sarah, though they'd done her no good. "I can get you there. Get this cleaned and stitched properly. After that," he met her eyes. "After that, you decide what happens next." Why? She was studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see through the shell of him to whatever broken pieces remained inside. "Why what?" "Why help me? You don't know me. You don't know what I might have done or who might come looking for me." Gideon considered the question while pressing a folded cloth against her wound, making her gasp. "I found you under a wagon in the middle of nowhere," he said. "Whatever you might have done, seems to me you've paid a price for it already." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or relief, or simple exhaustion finally winning out. "The others?" "Gone. All of them. I'm sorry." She closed her eyes for a moment, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "There was a girl, 12 years old, red hair, traveling with her aunt. I'm sorry, Gideon said again, and meant it. The woman nodded once, accepting this information the way someone accepts news of bad weather. Inevitable, unchangeable, one more thing to endure. Then we should go, before they come back. They won't come back. Raiders don't return to the same place, nothing left worth taking. He was already working to lift her, trying to ignore her sharp intake of breath. But you're right about leaving. You need proper care, and this place. He looked around at the scattered bodies, the destroyed wagons, the waste of it all. This place is for burying, not healing. Getting her onto Prudence was a careful exercise in managed agony. The woman, he still didn't know her name, bit down on her lower lip hard enough to draw fresh blood but didn't cry out. Gideon mounted behind her, one arm wrapped around her waist to keep her steady, the other hand on the reins. I'm going to ride slow, he said, but even slow is going to hurt. If you need to stop, I won't need to stop. Her voice was faint but determined. I've endured worse. Gideon believed her. Wolves. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of amber and rust when the cabin finally came into view, a dark shape against the hillside. Gideon had spoken truth about the 3-hour ride, though it had felt longer with the woman's weight gradually growing heavier against his chest as her consciousness faded in and out. She'd been quiet for most of the journey, occasionally murmuring something he couldn't quite hear, once whispering a name, Philip, in a tone that mixed anger and grief in equal measure. Gideon hadn't asked. He'd promised no questions, and he kept his promises even now, even when most other things seemed pointless. Prudence knew the way home without guidance, following the familiar path up the gradual slope to where the cabin stood in its clearing of rough grass. Gideon had built it deliberately distant from the nearest settlement, a full day's ride to Clearwater, the closest thing to a town in this section of the territory. After Sarah died, the distance had seemed like mercy. Now, looking at the woman slumped against him, blood seeping through the bandages he'd hastily applied, he wondered if isolation was about to become a liability. He dismounted carefully, easing the woman down with him. She was barely conscious now, her skin pale and cold despite the day's heat. Gideon carried her inside, using his shoulder to push open the door, and laid her on the bed, the only real bed in the cabin, the one he'd shared with Sarah, the one he now avoided by sleeping in the loft space above. The cabin's interior was spare and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel empty of the small decorations Sarah had once arranged there. A rough table with 2 chairs, he'd never put away the second one, sat near the window. Shelves held basic supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried meat. A cabinet contained the medical kit the doctor had left behind, useless for Sarah but perhaps useful now. Gideon lit the oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam, then set to work with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned field medicine through necessity rather than training. He cut away what remained of the woman's dress. Expensive silk, he noted distantly, with embroidery that must have taken months, trying to preserve her modesty as best he could while exposing the wound. The bullet had passed clean through, which was the best news he'd had all day. No digging required. But the entrance and exit wounds were ugly, already showing signs of infection around the edges. He'd need to clean them thoroughly, then stitch them closed, then hope her body was strong enough to fight off the fever that would almost certainly come. He heated water over the fire, poured whiskey into a clean cloth, and began the work. The woman woke screaming when he pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth against the wound, her back arched, her hands grabbing at his wrists with surprising strength. I know, Gideon said quietly, holding her down with gentle firmness. I know it hurts, but infection will kill you slower and meaner than this will. She stopped struggling, though tears streamed down her temples into her hair. Her eyes focused on his face, searching for something, reassurance maybe, or just confirmation that he meant what he'd said about helping. You're safe here, Gideon said, and realized with some surprise that he meant it. I promise you're safe. She nodded once, then deliberately turned her head to the side, offering her neck in a gesture of trust, so complete it made something twist in Gideon's chest. The first thing he'd felt in 3 years besides the constant dull ache of Sarah's absence. He worked as quickly as he could, cleaning both wounds, threading a needle with hands that barely shook, and stitching the torn flesh back together with small, careful stitches. The woman never cried out again, though he could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the blanket beneath her hard enough to turn her knuckles white. When he finally finished, wrapping clean bandages around her torso, she was conscious but clearly exhausted, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Fever comes next, usually. Next few days will tell us if you're going to make it." "I'll make it." She said it with such certainty that Gideon almost believed her. "I didn't survive." She stopped, closing her eyes. "I didn't survive this long to die in a stranger's bed." "You have a name?" Gideon asked, surprising himself. "Don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but seems like I should call you something." She was quiet for so long he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then, "Marina, call me Marina." It wasn't her real name. Gideon was certain of that. The hesitation before speaking, the way she said it like trying on a coat that didn't quite fit, everything about it screamed false, but he'd promised no questions. "Marina," he repeated, testing the name. "I'm Gideon. Gideon Hale. This is my land, such as it is. You can stay as long as you need to heal. And then? And then you decide. Like I said before, what happens next is your choice." She studied him again with that unsettling intensity. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Someone who would ask questions." Gideon stood, gathering the bloody cloths and used bandages. "I've learned that most folks out here have reasons for keeping their pasts quiet. Those reasons are usually their business, not mine. Even when those reasons might bring danger to your door?" He paused, considering. "Even then. Frontier's dangerous enough without borrowing trouble from other people's histories." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Though I'd appreciate a warning if someone's likely to come looking for you with guns drawn." "They won't use guns." Marina's voice was fading now, sleep or unconsciousness pulling her down. "They'll use money, contracts, the law, maybe, but not guns. That's not how people like them operate." "People like them?" But she was already asleep, her breathing evening out into the shallow but steady rhythm of someone whose body had decided survival was still worth the effort. Gideon stood watching her for a long moment, this stranger who'd appeared beneath a burning wagon, like something from a fever dream, bringing with her the first real mystery, the first real anything he'd encountered since Sarah died. He should have been worried, should have been calculating the risks, thinking through the possibilities, preparing for whatever complications she might bring. Instead, he found himself simply grateful that the cabin didn't feel quite so empty tonight. He carried the bloody cloths outside, dumped them in a bucket to be burned later, and stood for a moment looking up at the emerging stars. The same stars Sarah used to watch with him from this exact spot, her hand in his, talking about the future they'd build together. "Don't know what I'm doing," he said to the sky, to Sarah's memory, to himself. "But I couldn't leave her there. You understand that, don't you?" The stars offered no answer, but Gideon hadn't expected one. He went back inside, climbed to the loft, and lay down on the narrow cot he'd made there. Below him, he could hear Marina's breathing, a sound that was somehow both foreign and comforting. For the first time in 3 years, Gideon Hale fell asleep thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. The fever came that night, just as he'd predicted. Gideon woke to the sound of Marina thrashing below, calling out names in a voice tight with delirium. He climbed down quickly, found her burning hot to the touch, tangled in the blankets like they were trying to drown her. "Easy," he said, working to free her arms. "You're safe, Don't let them take me back!" Her eyes were open but unseeing, focused on something only fever could show her. "I won't go back. I'd rather die. Do you hear me, Philip? I'd rather die." "Nobody's taking you anywhere." Gideon pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, trying to bring the fever down through sheer stubborn repetition. "You're in my cabin, in the hills, just you and me. Nobody else knows you're here." "Liar." But some of the panic left her voice. "Everyone always knows. That's how it works when you're—" She trailed off, her head turning restlessly on the pillow. "When you're what?" Gideon asked, but she didn't answer. He spent the night bringing water from the well, soaking cloths in it, pressing them against her burning skin. When she shivered, he covered her. When she kicked the blankets away, he removed them. Hour after hour, He tended her with the same patient determination he'd once used to nurse sick cattle through hard winters, the only difference being that this mattered more than he wanted to admit. Dawn found them both exhausted, Marina finally sleeping peacefully, Gideon slumped in the chair beside the bed with his head tipped back against the wall. He woke to find her watching him. "You stayed," she said. Her voice was weak but clear, the delirium burned away by the fever's passing. Fever tends to kill people who are left alone during it. Gideon straightened, his back protesting the night spent in the chair. "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot and spent a day on horseback and a night in hell." She tried to smile. "So, better than yesterday." Gideon found himself smiling back, the first real smile in 3 years. "That's good. Means you're probably going to live." "Probably?" "Well, infection could still set in, and you'll need to stay still for a while, let those stitches hold. And you'll need to eat something, build your strength back up, and—" "I understand." Marina cut him off gently. "I'm not out of danger yet. Thank you for your honesty." Gideon nodded, suddenly awkward, unsure what to say next. The night's intimacy, her vulnerability, his care, felt different in daylight, harder to navigate. Marina solved the problem for him. "I said things last night, during the fever. People usually do. Did I say anything that made you want to reconsider your generosity?" Gideon thought about the fear in her voice when she'd begged not to be taken back. The way she'd said she'd rather die. Whatever she was running from, it terrified her more than death itself. "No," he said simply. "You didn't." Relief washed across her face, so profound it almost hurt to witness. "Thank you. Can you eat? I've got bread, some dried meat I can soften in broth. Nothing fancy, but it's nourishing." "That sounds perfect." He prepared a simple meal while she watched from the bed, her eyes following his movements with an attention that should have made him uncomfortable but somehow didn't. When he brought her the bowl of bread soaked in broth, she ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd been taught proper manners in a world very different from this cabin. "You live here alone?" she asked between small bites. "Yes." "By choice?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to share. "My wife died 3 years ago. Haven't much felt like company since." "I'm sorry." And she sounded like she genuinely was. "That must be very difficult." "It was." He paused, surprised to hear himself using past tense. "It is. But you get used to it, I suppose. The emptiness." "No," Marina said quietly. "You don't. You just get better at carrying it." Their eyes met, and Gideon saw his own grief reflected back at him. Different in origin, maybe, but identical in weight. Here was someone who understood loss not as an abstract concept, but as a living thing, a constant companion. "Who did you lose?" he asked before he could stop himself. Marina smiled sadly. "Myself, mostly, the person I thought I was supposed to be." She set down the bowl, her appetite apparently gone. "That probably sounds dramatic." "No," Gideon said. "It sounds honest." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun streaming through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, Prudence whinnied softly, probably demanding her breakfast. The world continued its normal routine, indifferent to the small revolution happening in this isolated cabin, two broken people finding unexpected connection and shared understanding. "Gideon?" Marina's voice was drowsy now, exhaustion pulling her back towards sleep. "Yes?" "When I'm stronger, will you teach me about this place? About the prairie? About surviving here?" "Why would you want to learn that?" She was already drifting off, but he heard her answer clearly. "Because I'm never going back. Which means this is home now. Might as well learn how to live in it." Gideon sat watching her sleep, turning her words over in his mind. She'd said it with such finality, "I'm never going back," as if she'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade, burned a bridge that couldn't be rebuilt. He recognized that determination. He'd felt it himself the day he'd stopped visiting Sarah's grave, the day he'd accepted that the past was gone and no amount of mourning would resurrect it. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the climbing sun, indifferent and vast. But here, in this small cabin, something was changing, Gideon could feel it the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. Inevitable, approaching, impossible to stop even if you wanted to. He wasn't sure yet if that change was dangerous or just different, but for the first time since Sarah died, he found himself curious about what came next. And that, more than anything else, felt like the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. Marina's recovery came in increments measured by small victories. The first day she could sit up without her vision swimming. The second day she could stand for a few moments before her legs trembled. By the end of the first week, she could walk from the bed to the table, though the effort left her breathing hard and clinging to the chair back for support. Gideon watched this progression with something approaching relief. He'd seen enough people die to recognize when someone had decided to live instead, and Marina had made that choice somewhere in those first fevered nights. Whatever waited for her out there in the world she'd fled, she'd decided it was worth surviving to face it on her own terms. They fell into a rhythm those first weeks, moving around each other in the cabin's small space with the cautious politeness of strangers sharing a stagecoach. Gideon would wake before dawn, as he always had, and set coffee to brewing over the fire. Marina would wake to the smell of it, slowly ease herself upright, and accept the cup he brought her without either of them speaking. Words seemed unnecessary in those early morning hours when the world was still soft and undefined. "Tell me about the prairie," Marina said one morning, breaking their comfortable silence. She was sitting at the table now, strong enough to stay upright for an hour or more, wearing one of Sarah's old dresses that Gideon had altered clumsily to fit her smaller frame. Gideon looked up from the harness he was mending. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How you read it, how you survive in it." She gestured toward the window where the endless grass swayed in the morning breeze. "It looks peaceful, but you move through it like a soldier in enemy territory, like it's always watching you." "It is watching. Everything out there is watching everything else. That's how things stay alive." He set down the harness. "The grass tells you where water runs underground, follows the moisture even when you can't see a creek. The birds tell you when predators are near. They go quiet when something dangerous moves through. The wind tells you when weather's coming, smells different when a storm's building, tastes like metal." Marina leaned forward, genuinely interested. "And people? How do you read them out here?" "Same way. You watch what they do more than what they say. Watch where their eyes go when they think you're not looking. Watch their hands. Hands tell the truth even when mouths lie." He paused, then added quietly, "You've got gentle hands. Hands that never did hard labor, but they're strong anyway, in a different way. Like they're used to holding power instead of holding tools." She looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "My mother insisted on piano lessons. Said a lady's hands were her most important asset, after her face and her ability to make pleasant conversation." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. She was wrong about which assets actually mattered, but the piano lessons stuck anyway. "There's a piano in Clearwater," Gideon said. "In the saloon, though it's badly out of tune. When you're stronger, if you wanted—" "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended. She softened it with a small smile. "Thank you, but no. That was part of the old life. I'm trying to learn how to live the new one." Gideon understood that impulse. He'd packed away everything of Sarah's except the clothes, packed them in a trunk, and shoved it into the far corner of the cabin where he wouldn't have to see them. Some people needed reminders of what they'd lost. Others needed to forget just to keep breathing. "All right then," he said. "New life. You want to learn the prairie? We'll start today. Sun's not too hot yet, and you're strong enough for a short walk." Marina's face lit up with an enthusiasm that made her look younger, less haunted. "Really? You mean it? Don't see why not. You'll need to know the land if you're planning to stay." He stood, retrieving his hat from its peg by the door. "But we go slow, and we turn back the minute you get tired. Last thing you need is to tear those stitches open." They walked for only 20 minutes that first day, staying close to the cabin, but Marina absorbed everything like parched ground drinking rain. Gideon showed her how to identify the safe springs from the alkali ones that would make you sick, how to read animal tracks in the soft dirt, how to tell direction by the way certain grasses leaned even when the sun was hidden. "The prairie tricks people," he explained, kneeling to point out a rabbit trail cutting through the tall grass. "Looks flat and empty, but it's full of dips and rises you can't see until you're right on top of them. People get lost out here all the time, think they're walking straight and end up going in circles. You always need landmarks, that rock formation, that lone tree, that particular hill. Keep 3 landmarks in sight at all times, and you'll always find your way back. Marina turned slowly, studying the landscape with new eyes. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never saw it before. When we were traveling, I was so focused on where we were going that I never really looked at where we were." "Where were you going?" Gideon asked before he could stop himself. She was quiet for a long moment, and he thought she might not answer. Then, "San Francisco. As far west as you can go without falling into the ocean. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I could become someone else. Someone new. And now?" Marina looked back at the cabin, small and solid against the hillside. "Now I think maybe distance doesn't matter as much as decision. You can run to the ocean and still be running, or you can stop right here and start building something different." They walked back slowly, Gideon deliberately matching his pace to hers, watching for signs of fatigue. He'd seen her wince once or twice when she stepped wrong, but she hadn't complained. Stubborn, he thought. Good. The frontier didn't have much use for people who gave up easy. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Marina asked him to tell her about the cabin. "Not much to tell," Gideon said, but she waited him out with patient silence until he continued. "Built it 6 years ago, me and Sarah. Took us 4 months, working sunrise to sunset. She was stronger than she looked, could lift and carry with the best of them." He smiled despite himself, remembering. "Had opinions, too, about every single thing. Wanted the door facing east so the morning sun would come in. Insisted on that stone chimney when I wanted to do mud and stick. Said a proper home needed a proper hearth." "She sounds remarkable," Marina said gently. She was. Died anyway. The old bitterness tried to rise up, but it felt weaker now, worn down by time and maybe by the presence of someone new to talk to. Consumption. Took her slow, gave us time to say everything that needed saying. Don't know if that made it better or worse. Better, Marina said with quiet certainty. Worse is when they're just gone, and all the things you needed to say stay locked up inside you forever, turning bitter and poisonous. Gideon looked at her across the table, seeing the shadow of old pain crossing her face. "Who didn't you get to say goodbye to?" "My brother, Thomas." She spoke his name like a prayer, reverent and aching. "He was going to help me. Had it all planned out. We'd leave together, go west, start over somewhere we could just be people instead of pieces in someone else's game. But he got sick, some fever that came on fast. Dead within a week, and I couldn't even go to his bedside because..." She stopped, closing her eyes. "Because proper ladies don't make scenes, don't show unseemly emotion, don't disrupt the household with their grief." "That's horseshit," Gideon said flatly. Marina's eyes snapped open, surprised into a laugh. "Yes," she agreed. "It is. Complete and utter horseshit. But it was also the rule, and I followed it because that's what I'd been trained to do. Follow the rules, play the part, never make anyone uncomfortable with something as messy as genuine feeling." She pushed her plate away, appetite gone. "Thomas died thinking I didn't care enough to fight for him. That's what I'll carry forever." "He didn't think that," Gideon said with certainty. "How could you possibly know?" "Because people who love each other know the difference between can't and won't. He knew you couldn't get to him, which is different from wouldn't. And if he loved you enough to plan an escape with you, he knew you well enough to understand why you couldn't break through whatever walls they'd put up." Marina was crying now, quietly, tears tracking down her face without any attempt to hide them. "Thank you for saying that. Wasn't trying to comfort you, was just saying what's true." Gideon stood, uncomfortable with her tears but understanding them. "I'll go check on Prudence, give you some privacy." "Gideon?" She stopped him at the door. "You don't have to keep leaving when I get emotional. I'm not as fragile as I probably seem." "Never thought you were fragile," he said honestly. "Fragile things don't survive what you survived, but sometimes a person needs to cry without an audience. I know I did, after Sarah." He left her to her grief, walking out into the cooling evening air. Prudence nickered softly when he approached, and he spent a while just standing with her, one hand on her neck, staring out at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, coyotes were starting their evening song. An owl called from the cottonwood tree down by the creek. The world kept turning, indifferent to human sorrow, and somehow that was comforting. When he came back inside an hour later, Marina had composed herself. She was sitting by the fire, Sarah's old shawl wrapped around her shoulders, staring into the flames. "I want to be useful," she said without preamble. "I can't just sit here recovering forever. Teach me to do something. Cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. You don't owe me labor for helping you. I know that, but I need to be useful. For myself, not for you." She looked up at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. "I spent too many years being decorative. I want to know I can actually do something that matters." Gideon considered this. "All right, tomorrow we'll start with bread. Can't live on cornbread alone, and I've got flour that needs using before it goes bad. After that, we'll see what else you want to learn." Marina smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the melancholy. "Thank you." The next morning, Gideon discovered that Marina's desire to be useful significantly outweighed her actual knowledge of practical skills. She attacked the bread making with such enthusiasm that flour ended up everywhere, in her hair, across her face, dusted across the table like snow. The first batch came out dense as a brick, the second burned on the bottom, but the third was actually edible, and Marina's triumphant expression when she pulled it from the fire made Gideon laugh out loud for the first time since Sarah's death. "Don't mock me," Marina said, trying to sound stern but unable to hide her own smile. "This is a significant achievement." "Not mocking," Gideon assured her. "Just appreciating your determination. Most people would have given up after the brick." "I don't give up." She said it simply, as fact. "It's basically my only consistent quality. Stubborn persistence in the face of common sense. That'll serve you well out here." They ate the successful loaf with butter Gideon had traded for in Clearwater, and Marina declared it the best thing she'd ever tasted, which was obviously a lie, but a charming one. Afterward, she insisted on cleaning up, and Gideon let her, recognizing that she needed to feel capable of something. The days began to blur together in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like contentment. Marina grew stronger, her movements more confident, the pain lines around her eyes gradually easing. She learned to make more than just bread, stews and beans and the bitter coffee that sustained frontier life. She learned to mend clothes with neat, careful stitches, learned to identify the edible plants that grew wild near the creek, learned to read the sky for weather, the way Gideon had taught her to read the grass for water. In return, without quite meaning to, Gideon found himself learning from her. She taught him that conversation could be more than just exchanged information. It could be pleasure for its own sake. She taught him that silence didn't always mean comfort, that sometimes people needed noise and laughter to remind them they were alive. She had a gift for storytelling, could spin elaborate tales about imaginary people in impossible situations that made him laugh despite himself. "Where do you come up with this nonsense?" he asked one evening after she'd told a particularly absurd story about a duchess who trained raccoons to steal jewelry from her enemies. "I spent a lot of years in very boring social situations," Marina said. "You develop a rich inner life when the outer one consists mainly of tea parties and strained small talk. I'd sit there nodding politely and imagine everyone as different animals, then build elaborate plots around what they'd do if they were actually foxes or wolves or, yes, raccoons, instead of just people in expensive clothes." "What animal would I be?" Gideon asked, surprising himself with the question. Marina tilted her head, studying him with open assessment. "A bear, I think. Powerful enough to be dangerous, but prefers to be left alone. Protective of its territory and the few things it cares about. Looks rough and intimidating, but is actually quite gentle unless provoked." "And you?" She laughed. "Oh, I'm definitely a fox. Clever enough to get into trouble, quick enough to usually get back out of it, and absolutely terrible at following anyone's rules but my own." "Foxes are survivors," Gideon said. "That fits." It was during the third week, when Marina was finally strong enough to walk a fair distance without tiring, that Gideon took her to see the grave. He hadn't planned to. The hillside where Sarah lay had been his private territory, a place he went alone when the weight of missing her became too heavy to carry around the cabin. But Marina had asked to see more of the property. and somehow his feet had carried them up the slope without conscious decision. "Oh," Marina said softly when they crested the rise and she saw the simple wooden marker. "Gideon, you didn't have to. I wouldn't have asked. I know you wouldn't have. That's why I'm showing you." He moved forward, running his hand along the top of the marker he'd carved himself, Sarah's name and dates cut deep into the weathered wood. "Feels right that you should know about her. She was the reason for most things I built, most choices I made. Seems dishonest somehow to have you living in her house without knowing she existed." Marina approached the grave respectfully, reading the marker. She was young, 28, barely got started living before it got cut short. Gideon knelt, pulling a few weeds that had sprouted around the base of the marker. "Used to come up here every day, then every few days. Now it's been almost a month since I visited. Feels like I'm forgetting her." "You're not forgetting her," Marina said gently. "You're just making room for the rest of your life to continue. That's not the same thing." "How do you know?" "Because I did the same thing with Thomas. At first I thought about him every second, and it felt like drowning. Then it was every hour, then every day, and each time the grief took up a little less space, I felt guilty, like I was betraying him by learning to breathe again." She knelt beside Gideon, her hand resting lightly on the grave marker. "But then I realized he wouldn't want me to drown. He'd want me to swim. And your Sarah, she wouldn't want you frozen in grief either." Gideon sat back on his heels, looking out over the prairie that rolled away in all directions. "I told her I'd take care of the place. Keep it going. Keep it beautiful. Felt like if I let it fall apart, if I let myself fall apart, then everything we built together would have been for nothing. And you've kept it going. The cabin's solid, the land's tended. You're still here living and working and surviving. That's keeping your promise." Marina stood, brushing dirt from Sarah's old dress. "But surviving doesn't mean you can't also live. She'd want you to do both. You talk like you knew her. I know you. And I know that people who love each other want the other person to be happy, even after they're gone. Especially after they're gone." She offered him her hand, helping him stand. "Thank you for sharing this with me, for trusting me with something so personal." Walking back down the hill, Gideon felt lighter somehow, as if by sharing Sarah's memory with someone else, he'd divided the weight of carrying it alone. Marina walked beside him in comfortable silence, and for the first time since finding her under that burning wagon, Gideon allowed himself to think about the future instead of just the present moment. That night after dinner, Marina broke their comfortable routine by asking a direct question. "What will you do when I'm fully healed? When I'm strong enough to leave if I wanted to?" Gideon set down his coffee cup carefully. "That would be your decision, not mine. Like I told you from the start, you decide what happens next." "But what do you want me to do?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine directly. Gideon took his time answering, knowing that words spoken now would set the shape of whatever came after. "I want you to do whatever makes you feel safe," he said finally. "If that means staying here, then you stay. If that means moving on to somewhere else, then you go. But I won't pretend I haven't gotten used to having you around. Place feels less empty with someone else in it." Marina's expression was difficult to read in the firelight. "I told you I was never going back. I meant to the life I left. But I'm realizing now that I don't actually know what going forward looks like. I never planned past escape." "Then maybe you stay until you figure it out. No rush, far as I'm concerned." He paused, then added, "And if you do decide to go eventually, I'd appreciate knowing where, just so I could stop wondering if you were all right out there." "You'd worry about me?" She sounded genuinely surprised. "Marina, I pulled you half dead from under a wagon and spent 2 weeks nursing you through fever. Be kind of foolish not to worry after investing that much effort in keeping you alive." She laughed, the sound warm and real. "That's very practical of you." "Practical's what I know how to be." "Yes," she agreed. "Among other things." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but something had changed between them. A line crossed, an acknowledgement made. They were no longer just strangers sharing space by accident. They were something else now, something neither of them had a name for yet, but both recognized as real. That night, after Marina had gone to bed and Gideon had climbed to his loft, He lay awake listening to her breathing below and thinking about choices and chances and the strange way life sometimes offered you something new, right when you'd convinced yourself you were done wanting anything at all. The answer came to him with quiet certainty. He wanted her to stay. Not because he needed help with the cabin, or because he was lonely, or because she reminded him what it felt like to care about someone's well-being. He wanted her to stay because she was sharp and brave and stubborn, because she made him laugh, because she'd looked at his grief and understood it without trying to fix it. He wanted her to stay because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped being a stranger he was helping and started being a person he'd miss if she left. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it settled over him like a familiar coat, unexpected but somehow right. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain building somewhere beyond the horizon. Inside the cabin, 2 people slept under the same roof, each of them changed by the other's presence in ways they were only beginning to understand. And on the hillside, Sarah's grave stood quiet and peaceful, the woman who slept there already becoming memory instead of presence, making room, as Marina had said, for the rest of life to continue. The rain came 3 days later, sweeping across the prairie in great gray sheets that turned the world soft and indistinct. Marina stood at the window watching it, her palm pressed against the glass, fascinated by the way it transformed the landscape into something from a dream. "Never seen rain before?" Gideon asked from where he sat mending a saddle strap. "Not like this. Back east, rain was an inconvenience, something that ruined garden parties and made the streets muddy. Here it's," she searched for the word, "essential. You can almost hear the land drinking it in. We needed it. Ground was getting hard, creek was running low." He set down his work, stretching his shoulders. "Means we're stuck inside for the day, though. Storm like this usually settles in for a while." Marina turned from the window with a smile that suggested she didn't mind being stuck inside at all. "Then I suppose you'll have to tell me more stories. About the cavalry, maybe. You mentioned you wore blue before you came here." Gideon's expression closed slightly, the way it always did when the conversation veered too close to certain territories. But Marina had learned to read him over the past weeks, had learned that his silence usually meant he was deciding whether to trust, not refusing outright. 6 years, he said finally. "Signed up when I was 22, thought I'd see the world, serve something larger than myself. Saw the world all right. Just turned out the world was mostly dust and blood and people dying for reasons that stopped making sense somewhere along the way." "Is that where you learned medicine, field surgery?" "Learned enough to keep people alive until the real surgeons could get to them. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't." He picked up the saddle strap again, his hands needing something to do. "Met Sarah during my last year. She was a laundress at the fort, came west with her family when she was 16. Stubborn as hell, no patience for military nonsense, called officers by their first names and didn't care who it offended." Marina laughed. "I would have liked her." "You would have. She'd have liked you too, I think. She always said the world needed more women who weren't afraid to speak their minds." His hand stilled on the leather. "Married her 3 months after we met. Got my discharge and we came here. Started building something that belonged to us instead of the army or the government or anyone else." "That's what I wanted," Marina said quietly. "Something that belonged to me. Choices that were mine to make." "What stopped you?" She moved from the window to the table, sitting across from him, the rain drumming steadily on the roof above them. "I was born into a family where everything was planned before I was old enough to have opinions about it. Which schools I'd attend, which social circles I'd move in, which man I'd eventually marry to strengthen which alliance. My brother Thomas and I, we were just game pieces being moved around a board by people who loved us but couldn't conceive of us having different wants than they'd assigned to us." "The man they wanted you to marry, was he cruel?" Gideon asked, surprising himself with the question. "Philip? No, not cruel. Just empty, like a beautifully decorated room with no furniture inside. He wanted a wife the way he wanted a matched set of horses, something that looked impressive and reflected well on him. The actual person inside the wife was irrelevant." She traced patterns on the wooden table with one finger. "When Thomas got sick, Philip sent flowers, expensive ones. But he never came himself, never asked how I was bearing up under it. When Thomas died, Philip's main concern was whether I'd be composed enough for the wedding we'd scheduled 3 months out. Jesus, Gideon muttered. I started planning my escape the day we buried Thomas. Took money from accounts I wasn't supposed to know about, bought passage west under a false name, hired those wagons to take me somewhere I could disappear. Her voice went flat. Philip's family must have discovered I was gone, must have hired someone to track me. Those raiders didn't just stumble on our caravan by accident. They knew which wagon I was in, knew to look for a woman traveling alone with expensive luggage. Gideon's hands had gone still on the saddle strap. You're saying those people died because of you? Yes. The word was barely a whisper. 12 innocent people murdered because I wanted freedom badly enough to take it. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That's who you've been sheltering, Gideon. Someone who bought her escape with other people's blood. The rain filled the silence between them, steady and indifferent. Gideon set down the leather strap and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression Marina couldn't read. You didn't pull the triggers, he said finally. You didn't hire the raiders or tell them to kill anyone. You tried to leave a situation that was suffocating you, and someone else decided violence was the appropriate response. That's on them, not you. You can't absolve me that easily. I'm not trying to absolve you, I'm telling you where the guilt actually belongs. He leaned forward, his voice firm. You want to carry some responsibility? Fine. Be responsible for being naive enough to think you could run without consequences. Be responsible for not anticipating that powerful people don't like losing their game pieces. But don't be responsible for murder you didn't commit. Marina wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. You're being generous. I'm being honest. There's a difference. He stood, moving to the fire to add another log. Besides, seems to me you've already paid a price. Got shot, lost everyone you were traveling with, nearly died in the dirt. Whatever debt you think you owe, I'd say the universe has collected. Philip won't see it that way. His family won't see it that way. Then it's a good thing we're a long way from anywhere Philip and his family have reached. Gideon turned from the fire to look at her. Unless you think they'll keep looking? Marina considered this carefully. The man who led the raid. I saw him before everything went wrong. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, not a common raider. Hired muscle for people with money and motivation. When he doesn't return with me, they'll assume I died in the attack. It's the logical conclusion. But you're not certain. I'm not certain of anything anymore except that I don't want to go back, and I'll do whatever it takes to avoid that. She met his eyes. Even if it means bringing danger to your door eventually. You deserve to know that risk. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, weighing the information against everything else he knew about this woman who'd appeared in his life like a storm blowing in off the prairie. Finally, he nodded once, decision made. Then we'll deal with it if it comes. Until then, you're safe here. Just like that? No conditions, no demands for more information, no insisting I leave before trouble finds us? Just like that. He returned to his chair, picked up the saddle strap, and went back to work as if they'd been discussing nothing more significant than the weather. Now, you going to help me with this tack or just sit there looking grateful? Marina laughed, the sound surprised out of her, and reached for the second strap that needed mending. They worked together in comfortable silence while the rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, and something that had been knotted tight in Marina's chest slowly began to loosen. The storm lasted 3 days, which meant 3 days confined to the cabin's small space. Gideon had worried it might feel claustrophobic, two people with complicated histories trapped together with nowhere to escape, but instead it felt almost conspiratorial, like they were children hiding from the adult world in a blanket fort. Marina proved to be skilled at cards, teaching Gideon games he'd never heard of with rules that seemed designed to be deliberately confusing. He taught her to play poker in return, discovering she had an excellent poker face until she drew a good hand, at which point a tiny muscle near her left eye would twitch. He didn't tell her about the tell, just stored the information away with a private smile. On the second day, she asked him to teach her to shoot. Inside, Gideon raised an eyebrow. During a rainstorm. I don't mean right this second, I mean in general, when the rain stops. She was standing at the window again, watching the water cascade off the roof. If I'm going to live out here, I should know how to defend myself. And how to hunt. if it comes to that. You ever handled a gun before? Once. Philip took me shooting at his family's estate. I was supposed to be impressed by his marksmanship and flattered that he'd share his hobby with me. Her lip curled slightly at the memory. I pretended to be terrible at it because men like Philip need to feel superior. But I wasn't actually terrible. I just didn't let him know that. Gideon found himself grinning. You're full of surprises. I spent years learning to hide what I was actually good at. Easier to let people underestimate you. She turned from the window. But I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be genuinely capable of things. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. He pulled his rifle from its place above the fireplace, checking the chamber to ensure it was empty before handing it to her. Here, get a feel for the weight, how it sits against your shoulder. When the weather clears, we'll do it proper. Marina handled the weapon with more confidence than he'd expected, settling it against her shoulder with only slight awkwardness, closing one eye to sight along the barrel. It's heavier than the gun Philip had me use. This is for serious work, not sport. Needs to drop a deer at distance or stop a man if it comes to that. He moved behind her, adjusting her stance slightly. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced. You're going to have kick when you fire, so you need to be braced for it. She made the adjustment, and Gideon noticed she didn't flinch at his proximity the way she had during those first weeks. Trust, he thought, hard-won and carefully built, but real nonetheless. All right, he said, stepping back. Now the most important part. Never point it at anything you're not willing to destroy. Gun's always loaded, even when it's not, and your finger stays off the trigger until you're ready to fire. These aren't suggestions, they're rules that keep people alive. Understood. Marina lowered the rifle carefully, offering it back to him. Thank you for taking this seriously, for not suggesting I don't need to know, because you'll protect me. I might not always be around to protect you. Besides, protection's not something one person does for another like a favor. It's something people do together if they're smart. Something flickered across Marina's face, an emotion too complex to name, and Gideon wondered what he'd said to put it there. But she just nodded and moved back to the window, and the moment passed into the general collection of small moments that were accumulating between them like sediment, building up layer by layer into something more solid than either of them had planned. On the third day, the rain finally eased to a drizzle, and by afternoon it had stopped entirely, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Gideon took Marina outside to see how the prairie had transformed, the grass impossibly green after drinking its fill, wildflowers opening like small miracles in places where yesterday there had been only dust. It's beautiful, Marina breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Wait until you see the sunset. After a big rain, sky puts on a show worth watching. They walked down to the creek, which had swelled from its usual trickle to a respectable stream, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Marina knelt at the edge, trailing her fingers through the current, and when she looked up at Gideon, she was smiling in a way he hadn't seen before, unguarded and genuinely happy. I know I'm supposed to miss my old life, she said. The comfort, the ease, the certainty of everything. But I don't. Not even a little bit. Is that terrible? No, Gideon said. That's honest. I like it here. I like the work, the learning, the feeling that I'm building something real instead of just maintaining an appearance. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I like who I'm becoming in this place. And who's that? I don't know yet, but she's someone I actually want to be, which is more than I could say before. They were standing close enough that Gideon could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could count the faint freckles the sun had started to bring out across her nose. For a moment, he let himself imagine closing that small distance, finding out if her lips were as soft as they looked. But Marina had come to him wounded and running, seeking safety, not romance, and he wouldn't take advantage of that vulnerability no matter how much he wanted to. So instead, he stepped back and gestured toward the cabin. Come on. We should get you started on shooting lessons before we lose the good light. If Marina was disappointed by his retreat, she didn't show it. She just nodded and followed him back up the slope, and Gideon tried not to think about the way her hand had briefly brushed his, or the electricity that simple contact had sent through his entire arm. The shooting lessons became a regular afternoon activity once Marina's strength fully returned. Gideon set up targets at varying distances, cans on fence posts, marks carved into trees, eventually a crude silhouette he drew on a piece of old canvas. Marina approached the lessons with the same determined focus she brought to everything, practicing until her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, never satisfied until she could hit the target more often than she missed. "You're a natural," Gideon told her after she'd put 3 shots through the canvas silhouette's center in rapid succession. "Better than natural, actually. You've got patience, which most people don't. They get frustrated and start rushing, which is when accuracy goes to hell." "I had a good teacher," Marina said, ejecting the spent shells and reloading with movements that had become smooth through repetition. "And I'm motivated. The thought of being helpless again, of having to depend entirely on someone else's protection." She shook her head. "Never again." "You were never helpless. Wounded isn't the same as helpless." "Wasn't it? If you hadn't found me, I'd have died under that wagon. If you hadn't brought me here, nursed me, taught me." She stopped, lowering the rifle. "I owe you everything, Gideon." "You don't owe me anything. We helped each other." "You think these past weeks have been easy for me, having someone to talk to again, having a reason to care about something beyond just getting through the day?" He took the rifle from her, setting it carefully aside. "You gave me back parts of myself I thought were dead and buried with Sarah. That's worth more than any debt you think you might owe." Marina was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a suddenness that caught him completely off guard, she kissed him. It was brief, barely more than a press of lips against lips, but it sent Gideon's heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. When she pulled back, her eyes were searching his face for a reaction. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have, if that was inappropriate." "It wasn't inappropriate," Gideon managed, his voice rough. "Just unexpected." "Was it unwelcome?" He should say yes, should establish boundaries, maintain the careful friendship they'd built, not complicate things with feelings that could make everything messy and difficult. Should remember that she was still healing, still finding her feet, still figuring out who she wanted to be. "No," he heard himself say instead. "It wasn't unwelcome." Marina's smile was radiant. "Good, because I've wanted to do that for at least 2 weeks now, and I was starting to think I'd have to be even more obvious, which seemed exhausting." Gideon laughed, the sound surprised out of him. "You wanted to be more obvious than kissing me?" "I've been finding excuses to touch you, standing unnecessarily close, asking you to adjust my shooting stance when I already know how to stand correctly. If that's not obvious, I don't know what is." "I thought you were just being friendly." "Gideon Hale, you are either the most respectful man I've ever met or the most oblivious." She was still smiling, her hand finding his with easy familiarity. "Given that you're generally quite observant about everything else, I'm choosing to believe it's respect." "Didn't want to assume," he said quietly. "Didn't want to take advantage of someone who'd come to me looking for safety. And that's exactly why I feel safe with you, because you see me as a person making choices, not a victim to be protected or an opportunity to be seized." She squeezed his hand. "I'm choosing this, Gideon. Choosing you, if you'll have me. Not because I'm grateful or dependent, but because I want to." Gideon pulled her close then, properly this time, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped around her waist. He kissed her the way he'd been wanting to for weeks, thoroughly, deeply, with all the pent-up longing he'd been carefully suppressing. Marina made a small sound of surprise that turned into something closer to satisfaction, her arms coming up to circle his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "This is going to complicate things." "Good," Marina said firmly. "I'm tired of uncomplicated things. They're boring. You realize people will talk if word gets out. Widow takes up with mysterious woman who appeared out of nowhere. Let them talk. I don't care what people think anymore. That was the whole point of running, remember? To stop living my life according to other people's expectations and opinions." "Fair enough." Gideon stepped back slightly, though he kept hold of her hands. "But we should probably be smart about this. Take it slow. Make sure we're both thinking clearly and not just, Gideon." Marina cut him off gently. "I appreciate the caution, I do, but I've spent my entire adult life being careful and measured and appropriate. I'd like to try something different now. I'd like to try being happy." And how could he argue with that? How could he insist on caution and distance when she was looking at him like he'd hung the moon, when her hands were warm in his, when the sunset he'd promised her was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson behind her? "All right," he said. "All right, we'll try being happy. See how that goes." Marina's answering smile was bright enough to rival the sunset, and when she kissed him again, Gideon stopped thinking about complications and just let himself feel the simple, startling joy of connection with another person. That night, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, Marina leaning against Gideon's shoulder in comfortable silence. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and wild and full of hidden dangers, but here in this small circle of lamplight, they felt safe. "Tell me something true," Marina said quietly. "Something you've never told anyone else." Gideon thought about deflecting, keeping his deeper truths locked away where they'd been living for 3 years. But Marina had trusted him with her secrets, her fears, her whole complicated history. He owed her the same honesty. "I was relieved when Sarah died," he said, and felt Marina go still against him. "Not that she was gone. That broke something in me I don't think will ever fully heal. But I was relieved that she wasn't suffering anymore, that I didn't have to watch her waste away day by day, that the waiting was finally over." He paused, forcing himself to continue. "And I've felt guilty about that relief every single day since. Like I somehow wanted it to happen, even though I would have given anything to save her." Marina's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. "That's not relief that she died. That's relief that her pain ended. There's a difference. Is there?" "Yes. And I think you know that, somewhere under all that guilt you've been carrying." She shifted to look up at him. "She wouldn't want you feeling guilty for being human, Gideon, for having complicated emotions about an impossible situation. Maybe not. But knowing what she'd want and feeling it are different things." "I know." Marina laid her head back against his shoulder. "My turn for a truth. I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of this. Of being happy. Every time I've had something good, it's been taken away. Thomas. My freedom. That brief period after I left when I thought I might actually make it to San Francisco and start over." Her voice wavered slightly. "I'm terrified that this place, this feeling of finally being home, is going to get ripped away too, and I don't know if I'll survive losing it." Gideon wrapped his arm more tightly around her. "I can't promise nothing will go wrong. Can't promise we won't face trouble down the line, or that life won't throw something at us we're not prepared for. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Marina repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and Gideon felt the future opening before them like the prairie itself, vast and uncertain, but no longer quite so empty. 3 weeks of peace followed that evening on the porch. 3 weeks where Gideon and Marina existed in a small world of their own making, building something neither of them had quite expected to find. The work of the homestead continued. There was always wood to split, fences to mend, animals to tend. But now the labor felt shared rather than solitary, and the evenings held conversation and laughter instead of hollow silence. Marina's skill with the rifle improved daily, until she could consistently hit targets that would have seemed impossible during those first lessons. She'd also taken to riding Prudence on short trips around the property, initially nervous but increasingly confident as the mare proved patient with her inexperience. Gideon watched these small victories with quiet pride, seeing her transform from the wounded woman under the wagon into someone capable and self-assured. They avoided Clearwater by unspoken agreement, neither of them eager to invite questions about Marina's presence or origin. Gideon had supplies enough to last another month, and when those ran low, he'd make the trip alone. There was time yet before the outside world needed to intrude on what they were building, but the outside world, as it turned out, had its own schedule. Gideon was working on the fence line along the eastern border of his property when he saw the rider approaching. The man sat his horse with the easy posture of someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle, and even from a distance, Gideon could see the quality of his clothes: tailored jacket, fine boots, a hat that cost more than most settlers earned in a month. Every instinct Gideon had developed during his cavalry years suddenly screamed danger. He set down the post he'd been preparing to set and walked deliberately back toward the cabin, keeping his movements casual but his senses alert. Marina was inside preparing lunch, and he needed to warn her before the stranger got close enough to see her clearly. But the rider was faster than Gideon had estimated, closing the distance with purposeful speed, and by the time Gideon reached the cabin door, the man was already within calling distance. "Good afternoon," the stranger said, his voice cultured and confident, carrying the crisp diction of someone educated back east. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water. It's been a long ride from Clearwater." "Water I can provide," Gideon said carefully, not moving from his position blocking the cabin door. "What brings you out this way?" "Not many travelers come through here without specific business." The man dismounted with practiced grace, looping his reins around the porch rail. Up close, Gideon could see he was perhaps 40, with sharp features and eyes that assessed everything they touched. "My name is Edmund Hartwell. I'm a private investigator hired by the Valcourt family to locate a missing person. Lady Marina Valcourt, to be specific." Gideon's expression didn't change, though his hand moved incrementally closer to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Can't help you. Don't know anyone by that name." "Of course not." Hartwell's smile was thin and knowing. "Though I wonder if you might have encountered her nonetheless. She disappeared approximately 2 months ago, was traveling west in the company of several hired wagons. Those wagons were found destroyed about 40 miles southeast of here, everyone aboard killed by raiders." "Heard about that," Gideon said, keeping his voice neutral. "Terrible business." "Indeed. However, we had reason to believe Lady Marina might have survived the attack. Her body wasn't found among the dead, you see, and certain items known to be in her possession were also missing." Hartwell paused, letting this information settle. "I've been searching the surrounding area, speaking with anyone who might have encountered a lone woman, possibly injured, possibly seeking help. Haven't seen anyone matching that description." "No?" Hartwell's eyes moved past Gideon to the cabin door, then to the windows. "That's curious, because the merchant in Clearwater mentioned you'd recently purchased fabric. Specifically, fabric suitable for a woman's dress. Unusual purchase for a widower living alone, wouldn't you say?" Gideon cursed inwardly at his own carelessness. He'd bought the fabric thinking only of Marina's comfort, not considering that such a purchase would raise questions in a small community where everyone knew everyone's business. "I make my own choices about what I buy and don't owe explanations to strangers," Gideon said, his voice hardening. "Now you've had your water, well's right there, help yourself. So I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business plain or move along." "My business is quite simple, Mr. Hale." Hartwell's use of his name confirmed he'd been asking questions in Clearwater, gathering information. "The Valcourt family wants their daughter returned safely. They're prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery. $5,000 to be precise." $5,000. A fortune by frontier standards, enough to buy land, stock it properly, live comfortably for years. Gideon saw the calculation in Hartwell's eyes, the assumption that poverty would override loyalty, that money would open doors stubbornness wouldn't. "Still can't help you," Gideon said flatly. "Don't know where your missing lady is." Before Hartwell could respond, the cabin door opened behind Gideon, and Marina stepped out onto the porch. She'd heard everything, Gideon realized, had been listening from inside, and made the choice to reveal herself rather than hide like a fugitive. "Hello, Edmund," she said calmly, as if greeting an acquaintance at a social function rather than the man hired to drag her back to the life she'd fled. "I see my family's become predictable. I should have expected they'd send a bloodhound instead of accepting the obvious conclusion." Hartwell's expression flickered with something that might have been admiration. "Lady Marina, I'm relieved to find you alive, though I confess your family will be less pleased with the circumstances of your survival. Living alone with a man in the wilderness, you understand how this appears." "I understand that appearances are the only thing my family has ever cared about, which is precisely why I left." Marina moved to stand beside Gideon, her shoulder brushing his in a gesture of unity. "You can report to Philip and his insufferable parents that you found me alive and well. You can also report that I have no intention of returning, now or ever." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make," Hartwell said, his tone regretful but firm. You are engaged to be married, with legal contracts signed by your late father. Breaking that engagement has significant financial and social consequences. Then let there be consequences. I don't care anymore. Perhaps not, but the law does care. Your father's estate is still in probate, and those contracts specify that your inheritance depends on fulfilling the terms of the engagement. If you refuse to return, you forfeit not only your own fortune, but also damage your mother's social standing and financial security. Hartwell paused. Additionally, there's the matter of the people who died protecting you during your flight. Their families have filed suit claiming negligence and seeking compensation. Your presence is required to settle these claims. Marina's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. That's a lie. Those people weren't protecting me. They were innocent travelers who happened to be in the wrong place when Phillips' hired thugs attacked. Phillips hired thugs? Hartwell raised an eyebrow. That's quite an accusation, Lady Marina. One you'd be hard-pressed to prove without evidence. Meanwhile, the official record shows you hired those wagons specifically for your transport, making you legally responsible for what befell them. You bastard, Marina breathed. They've manufactured a case to force me back. They've simply ensured you'll face consequences for your choices, as we all must. Hartwell's expression softened slightly. I take no pleasure in this, truly, but I am being paid to bring you home, and the law supports my authority to do so. Gideon had remained silent during this exchange, his mind working through options and finding few that didn't end in violence. He could refuse to let Hartwell take Marina, but that would make him an accomplice to whatever legal fiction had been constructed around her disappearance. He could shoot Hartwell, but that would make them both fugitives, and more investigators would follow. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. There was no good way out that didn't involve sacrifice. How long do I have? Marina asked quietly. I'm prepared to give you until tomorrow morning to gather your things and say your goodbyes, Hartwell said. I'll make camp a respectful distance away, return at dawn. That seems fair, given the circumstances. Fair, Marina repeated bitterly. Yes, of course, how very civilized of you. Hartwell mounted his horse, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. For what it's worth, Lady Marina, I hope you find some peace eventually, though I suspect it won't be found by running. He rode away at an easy pace, not bothering to look back, confident in his legal authority and the power of the forces backing him. Gideon and Marina stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. Then Marina's legs seemed to give out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. It's over, she said dully. Everything we built here, everything I thought I could become, it's all over. Gideon sat beside her, his mind still working through possibilities. Not necessarily. Gideon, you heard him. They've got lawyers, contracts, legal claims. They've made it so I either return or destroy my mother financially and let innocent families suffer for my choices. She laughed without humor. It's brilliant, really. They know I won't let others pay for my freedom. What if you weren't Lady Marina Valcourt anymore? She looked at him, confusion replacing despair. What are you talking about? Marriage changes your legal status, changes your name, transfers certain rights and responsibilities. Gideon kept his voice calm, though his heart was hammering. If you were married to someone else before Hartwell comes back tomorrow, those contracts Phillips' family is holding become void. Can't enforce an engagement to a married woman. Marina stared at him. You're suggesting we get married? Tonight? I'm suggesting we solve your problem in a way that lets you keep your freedom while protecting the people you care about. He met her eyes. Unless you have a better idea. But there's no one to perform a ceremony out here. No judge, no minister. Don't need one for a common law marriage. Frontier recognizes such things differently than cities do. We declare ourselves married before a witness, live as husband and wife, and the law considers it binding. He paused. Would need a witness, though, someone who could testify if it came to that. Who would? Marina stopped, thinking. The merchant in Clearwater, the one who told Hartwell about the fabric. If we rode there tonight, asked him to witness, he knows me, knew Sarah. He's a good man, wouldn't ask questions we didn't want to answer. Gideon stood, offering Marina his hand. But this only works if you're sure. I won't trap you in one unwanted marriage to save you from another. Marina took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Is this what you want? Truly? Not just as a solution to my problem, but as something you'd choose for yourself? Gideon thought about the past 2 months, about the way the cabin had stopped feeling empty, about morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, and evening conversations that stretched late into the night. He thought about the way Marina laughed when something genuinely amused her, about her stubborn determination to master skills she'd never needed before, about the softness in her eyes when she looked at him. Yes, he said simply. This is what I'd choose. Then let's do it. Let's get married tonight and let Edmund Hartwell return to Philip empty-handed tomorrow. Marina's expression shifted from despair to determination. But Gideon, I need you to understand, this will make you part of my mess. Philip's family won't just accept this quietly. They'll fight it, challenge the marriage's validity, maybe send more people. Let them come. Gideon's voice was steel. This is my land, my home, and you'll be my wife. Anyone who wants to change that will have to go through me first. They rode for Clearwater as the sun dropped toward the horizon, pushing Prudence harder than Gideon liked, but needing to reach the town before full dark. Marina rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, and he could feel the tension in her body, part fear, part hope, part disbelief that escape might actually be possible. Clearwater was barely worthy of the name town, just a collection of buildings clustered around a crossroads where two wagon routes intersected. The general store occupied the largest structure, with the merchants' living quarters in the back. A saloon, a boarding house, a livery stable, and a handful of smaller businesses completed the settlement. Maybe 50 people lived there permanently, with another 100 scattered on homesteads within a day's ride. Gideon tied Prudence outside the general store and helped Marina down, her legs stiff from the hard ride. Through the window, they could see Matthias Cooper, the merchant who'd inadvertently revealed Gideon's fabric purchase, arranging goods on shelves by lamplight. You ready? Gideon asked. Marina nodded, squaring her shoulders. Let's go become respectable. Cooper looked up when they entered, his weathered face registering surprise at seeing Gideon with a woman. He was in his 60s, had run this store for 20 years, and knew every settler within riding distance. Gideon, he said, setting down the can he'd been shelving. Wasn't expecting you. Need supplies? Need a favor, Matthias, a big one, and I'd appreciate discretion about it. Cooper's eyes moved between Gideon and Marina, taking in their travel-stained clothes and the urgency in their posture. What kind of favor? We need a witness. To a marriage declaration. Cooper's eyebrows rose, but he didn't ask the obvious questions. You know I'm not ordained, can't make it official that way. Don't need ordained, just need someone trustworthy to witness that we spoke the words and meant them. Frontier law recognizes that as binding. It does, Cooper agreed slowly, though most folks still prefer a proper ceremony when they can get one. We can't get one, Marina said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was calm but carried weight. And we need this done tonight. I know how it looks, and I know you don't know me, but I promise you we're not doing anything wrong, just trying to stop something wrong from being done to us. Cooper studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, don't need to know the details. Gideon's a good man, and that's reference enough for me. He moved toward the back of the store. Give me a minute to get my wife. She should be part of this too, make it more solid if anyone questions it later. He disappeared through the curtain separating the store from the living quarters, leaving Gideon and Marina alone among the barrels of flour and shelves of dry goods. Marina reached for Gideon's hand and he squeezed it gently. Last chance to back out, he said quietly. I don't want to back out. Do you? No. Cooper returned with his wife, Elizabeth, a sturdy woman with kind eyes who'd known Sarah and had brought food to Gideon in those first terrible weeks after her death. She looked surprised, but not judgmental, which was all Gideon could ask for. Well then, Cooper said, lighting an additional lamp to brighten the store. Don't rightly know the proper words for this, so I suppose plain speaking will have to do. You two want to declare yourselves married? We do, Gideon said. In that case, speak your intentions clear so Elizabeth and I can bear witness. Gideon turned to face Marina fully, taking both her hands in his. The moment felt both enormous and strangely simple, just two people choosing each other in a general store lit by lamplight, with the smell of coffee and leather and tobacco hanging in the air. I, Gideon Hale, take you, Marina, as my wife, he said, keeping his voice steady. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and stand with you against whatever comes. From this day forward, you have my loyalty, my home, and my name if you want it. Marina's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice didn't waver. I, Marina Valcourt, take you, Gideon Hale, as my husband. I promise to stand beside you, to share the work and the joy, to build a life worth living in this place we've both chosen. From this day forward, you have my trust, my partnership, and my devotion. Then by the authority granted me as a witness to your freely spoken words, Cooper said formally, I declare you husband and wife. May you build something good together. Elizabeth stepped forward, kissing Marina's cheek and then Gideon's. Welcome to the family, dear. Any wife of Gideon's is a friend of ours. Marina hugged the older woman, overcome with emotion and gratitude. Thank you, both of you. You don't know what this means. Don't need to know, Elizabeth said warmly. Just need to know you're both sure of what you're doing. We are, Gideon confirmed. He pulled a small pouch from his pocket, offering it to Cooper. For your trouble. Put that away, Cooper said firmly. Don't take payment for witnessing love, even the complicated kind. He paused. Though if you wanted to explain what's really happening here, I'd listen without judgment. Gideon looked at Marina, who nodded permission. Briefly, he outlined the situation. Marina's flight from an arranged marriage, the investigator who'd found her, the legal trap that had been set, and their solution. Cooper listened without interrupting, then shook his head admiringly. Smart. Can't enforce a betrothal to a married woman, and common law marriage is recognized by territorial law. They'll fight it, though. Let them fight, Marina said. I'm done running, done hiding who I am or what I want. If they want to challenge this marriage, they can do it in court where I'll have the chance to defend myself instead of just being shipped back east like cargo. You'll need documentation, Elizabeth said practically. Something showing the marriage was witnessed and recorded. Matthias, can you write it up proper? Cooper moved to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. With careful script, he composed a brief document declaring that Gideon Hale and Marina Valcourt had entered into marriage by mutual consent, witnessed by Matthias and Elizabeth Cooper on this date. Both witnesses signed, then Gideon and Marina added their signatures. Keep this safe, Cooper said, handing the paper to Gideon. And if that investigator gives you trouble, send for me. I'll testify to what happened here tonight. They thanked the Coopers again, then rode back toward the cabin through darkness broken only by starlight. Marina leaned against Gideon's back, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the past few hours. We're married, she said, testing the words. I can barely believe it. Having second thoughts? No. Are you? No. Gideon guided Prudence carefully across the familiar path, trusting the mare's instincts in the dark. Though I'll admit this isn't how I imagined proposing if I ever did again. How did you imagine it? Don't know. Something less desperate, I suppose, more romantic. Marina laughed softly. Gideon, you just married me to save me from being dragged back to a life I despise, fully knowing it would bring complications and danger to your doorstep. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me. They reached the cabin near midnight, both bone-tired but too keyed up to sleep. Gideon built up the fire while Marina changed into one of the simple dresses she'd made from the fabric that had inadvertently betrayed her presence. When she emerged, she looked young and uncertain, and Gideon realized they were both navigating new territory. I can sleep in the loft, he offered, if you want space to process everything. Gideon, we just got married. Sleeping in separate rooms seems counterproductive. She moved closer, taking his hands. Unless you want space. No. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. Just didn't want to assume. Stop being so respectful. I appreciate it, truly, but right now I just need you to hold me and tell me everything's going to be all right. So he did, carrying her to the bed and lying down with her still in his arms, both of them fully clothed and too exhausted for anything but comfort. Marina curled against his chest, her breathing gradually slowing as tension drained away. Do you think it'll work? she asked sleepily. Do you think Hartwell will accept the marriage and leave us alone? Don't know, Gideon admitted. But we'll find out tomorrow. Tomorrow, Marina echoed, her voice fading. Our first full day as husband and wife, and we'll spend it confronting my past. Somehow, that feels appropriate. Gideon waited until her breathing deepened into sleep, then allowed himself to relax slightly. They'd done what they could, made their choice, created their shield, put themselves on record as a united front. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but at least they weren't facing it alone anymore. He thought about Sarah, wondered if she'd approve of what he'd done. Probably would have, he decided. Sarah had never been one for following rules that didn't make sense, and she'd always believed people should fight for what mattered to them. This mattered. Marina mattered. And if Philip Valcourt and his hired investigators wanted to challenge that, they'd discover that a man defending his home and his wife was a considerably more dangerous opponent than a grief-hollowed widower with nothing left to protect. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain building somewhere beyond the horizon. Inside the cabin, two people slept in each other's arms, married in the eyes of the law and bound by choice, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. Dawn came too quickly, pale light filtering through the cabin windows and pulling Gideon from restless sleep. Marina was already awake beside him, staring at the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone running through scenarios in their mind. What time is it? She asked without looking at him. Early. Sun's barely up. Gideon sat up, running a hand through his hair. Hartwell said dawn. He'll be here soon. Marina nodded and rose from the bed, moving to the window to watch the eastern horizon. She'd changed something in the night. There was a steel in her posture now, a determination that replaced yesterday's despair. Gideon recognized it from his cavalry days, the shift that happened in soldiers between knowing a fight was coming and actually facing it. Whatever happens, she said quietly, thank you for giving me the choice, for not deciding what was best for me and forcing me into it. You don't need to thank me for treating you like a person with agency. You'd be surprised how rare that actually is. She turned from the window, and Gideon saw she'd been crying silently, though her voice remained steady. I'm scared, Gideon. Not of going back. I meant what I said. I'll never go back willingly. But I'm scared of what they might do to you for helping me. Scared they'll find some way to hurt you to get to me. Gideon crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. I've been hurt before. Survived it. Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it together. That's what the marriage means, right? Together. Together, she repeated, and some of the tension left her shoulders. They made coffee and a simple breakfast neither of them had much appetite for, then waited. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the prairie grass. Birds sang their territorial claims from fence posts and trees. The world continued its normal progression, indifferent to human drama. Hartwell appeared just as the sun cleared the horizon completely, riding the same fine horse and wearing the same expensive clothes, looking fresh despite supposedly camping overnight. Gideon suspected he'd actually spent the night in Clearwater's boarding house, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the man's expression when he saw both Gideon and Marina waiting for him on the porch, standing close together in a way that made their relationship unmistakable. Good morning, Hartwell said, dismounting with that same practiced grace. I trust you've had time to prepare for the journey, Lady Marina. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Hartwell. Marina's voice was calm and clear. And it's Mrs. Hale now, actually. I was married last night. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but Gideon saw calculation flash through his eyes. I see. A sudden decision. Not as sudden as you might think, Marina replied, but conveniently timed, I'll admit. And you have documentation of this marriage? Witnesses who can attest to its legitimacy? Hartwell pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, flipping it open. Because I'm afraid a hasty ceremony performed without proper authority won't hold up against the existing contracts. Gideon pulled the document Cooper had written from his own pocket, unfolding it carefully. Common law marriage properly witnessed and documented. Territorial law recognizes it as legally binding. You're welcome to examine it. Hartwell took the paper, reading it with professional thoroughness. Gideon watched his face, saw the moment the investigator realized the marriage was solid enough to create real legal complications. Matthias Cooper, Hartwell read aloud. The merchant from Clearwater. Convenient that he was willing to witness this so quickly. He's known me for 6 years, Gideon said. Known me to be an honest man. When I asked for his help, he gave it. I'm sure he did. Hartwell folded the paper and handed it back. However, this doesn't actually solve the problem. The contracts Lady Marina, Mrs. Hale, signed were witnessed by her father and legally binding at the time of signature. A subsequent marriage doesn't void them, merely complicates their enforcement. Those contracts were signed under duress, Marina said firmly. I was 17 years old, had no legal counsel of my own, and was told signing was my duty to my family. No court would uphold them if I contested. Perhaps not, but contesting would require you to appear in court, which means returning east to testify. Hartwell's smile was thin. And once you're there, surrounded by your family's considerable influence and resources, how confident are you that any judge would rule in your favor over the word of the Valcourt family? Is that a threat? Gideon's hand moved incrementally closer to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. It's a statement of fact. Hartwell shifted his attention to Gideon. Mr. Hale, I understand you believe you're protecting this woman, but you're making yourself vulnerable to serious legal consequences. Harboring someone with outstanding legal obligations, interfering with the execution of valid contracts, potentially even kidnapping if the Valcourts choose to frame it that way. Kidnapping? Marina's laugh was sharp and bitter. I came here of my own will, married of my own will, and I'm staying of my own will. There's no kidnapping involved. That's your version of events. The Valcourts have a different version, one supported by the testimony of the wagon drivers' families, who claim you hired them under false pretenses and led them into danger. Hartwell pulled another document from his jacket, this one several pages thick. Lawsuits claiming wrongful death, seeking damages. Your presence is required to defend against these claims, or judgment will be entered against your estate by default. Marina took the document with shaking hands, scanning the pages. Gideon watched her face pale as she read, saw the way the trap's full scope was revealed to her. They're asking for amounts my estate can't possibly cover, she whispered. This would bankrupt my mother, leave her destitute. Unless you return and negotiate a settlement, Hartwell said gently, which the Valcourts are prepared to facilitate, provided you fulfill your original obligations. You mean provided I marry Philip and disappear quietly into the life they've planned for me? I mean provided you act like an adult and honor your commitments instead of running away like a child. There was steel under Hartwell's reasonable tone now. You don't get to escape consequences just because you're unhappy, Lady Marina. The real world doesn't work that way. Gideon had remained silent during this exchange, watching Marina process the information, seeing her visibly deflate under the weight of manufactured guilt and legal manipulation. He recognized the tactic. Apply enough pressure from enough angles that resistance seems futile, make capitulation look like the only reasonable choice. He'd seen it break soldiers during the war, seen good men convinced to do terrible things because all other options had been systematically eliminated. But he'd also seen people resist that pressure, find creative solutions that no one had anticipated. What if she didn't have an estate? Gideon asked suddenly. Both Marina and Hartwell turned to look at him. I'm sorry, Hartwell said. You said the lawsuits are against her estate. What if there was no estate to sue? What if she'd already divested herself of all property and holdings before the suits were filed? Understanding dawned on Marina's face. A married woman's property becomes her husband's under territorial law. If I transferred everything to Gideon before these suits were officially served, that would be transparent fraud, Hartwell interrupted. Any judge would see through such an obvious attempt to evade legitimate claims. Would they, though? Gideon kept his voice calm, thoughtful. Seems to me that a woman getting married and combining assets with her husband is pretty standard practice. Nothing fraudulent about it. And if those assets happen to be in my name when these suits arrive, well, they'd have to sue me instead. And I'm not party to any contracts or obligations involving the Valcourt family. Hartwell's expression had gone cold and professional. You're suggesting she sign over her entire inheritance to you? A man she's known for what, 2 months? That seems remarkably trusting. Or remarkably desperate, Marina said. Which I am, Mr. Hartwell. You've made it clear that my family has constructed an elaborate cage designed to force my return. But every cage has weaknesses, and I think Gideon just found one. Even if this strategy worked, which I doubt, you'd be penniless, Hartwell pointed out. Completely dependent on Mr. Hale's goodwill. Is that really preferable to returning to a life of comfort and security? Yes. Marina didn't hesitate. Absolutely yes. I'd rather have nothing and be free than have everything and be owned. Hartwell studied them both for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're making a mistake, both of you, but I can see you're determined to make it anyway. He moved toward his horse, gathering the reins. I'll report to the Valcourts that I found you alive, married, and refusing to return. What they choose to do with that information is their decision. Tell them something else, too, Marina said, her voice carrying across the distance. Tell them that Marina Valcourt is dead. She died under that wagon 2 months ago. The woman standing here is Marina Hale, and she doesn't owe them anything. Hartwell mounted smoothly, settling into his saddle. I'll deliver your message, though I suspect they won't accept it quite so easily. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of farewell. Mrs. Hale. Mr. Hale. I wish you luck. You're going to need it. He rode away without looking back, and Gideon and Marina stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did Marina's legs give out, forcing her to sit heavily on the porch steps. Did we just make everything worse? She asked quietly. Maybe. Or maybe we just called their bluff. Gideon sat beside her. Question is, what do we do now? You actually want to sign over your inheritance, or was that just something to say to make him leave? Marina was quiet for a long time, staring out at the prairie where morning light turned the grass to gold. I need to tell you something, she said finally, about what I'm actually worth, financially speaking. You don't owe me an accounting. No, I do. If we're really going to do this, if we're going to be partners, you deserve to know what you're getting into. She took a deep breath. My father was Baron Valcourt, which sounds impressive but was actually more title than substance. The family had money once, generations ago, but most of it was gone by the time I was born. What remained was invested poorly, spent on maintaining appearances. By the time my father died, the estate was deeply in debt. Then what are the Valcourts actually after? Control, and my mother's properties, which are considerable. She brought significant wealth to the marriage. Land holdings, investments, business interests. Under the terms of their marriage contract, if I fulfill my obligations and marry appropriately, those properties stay under Valcourt family management. If I don't, they revert to my mother's control, and she's already indicated she'd sell them off and move back to her family's estate in Virginia. Gideon processed this information. So this isn't really about you at all. It's about keeping control of your mother's wealth. Exactly. I'm just the convenient leverage they're using. Philip doesn't actually want to marry me. He wants access to the properties that marriage would secure. Marina laughed without humor. The irony is that I don't actually care about any of it. Let them have the properties, the titles, the whole complicated mess. I just want to be left alone to live my own life. Then let's make it official. Let's write to your mother, explain the situation, tell her to do whatever she wants with her properties because you're not coming back to facilitate anyone else's financial schemes. Gideon stood, offering Marina his hand. And then we bury this whole mess and move on. Marina took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. You make it sound so simple. Might not be simple, but it's clear. We make our position plain, remove ourselves from their calculations, and build our own life here without them. He cupped her face gently. Unless you're having second thoughts about the marriage, because it's not too late to... She kissed him, hard and fierce, cutting off his words. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright but determined. No second thoughts. I meant every word I said yesterday. You're my choice, Gideon. This life is my choice. Everything else can burn for all I care. They spent the rest of that day composing a letter to Marina's mother, working through multiple drafts until they had something that balanced honesty with kindness. Marina explained her marriage, her decision to stay in the frontier territories, and her complete renunciation of any claim to family properties or titles. She urged her mother to make whatever arrangements would secure her own financial future without considering Marina's participation. Do you think she'll understand? Marina asked as she sealed the letter with wax. Don't know, but you're giving her the information she needs to make her own choices. That's all you can do. They rode to Clearwater the next morning to post the letter, and while there, Marina made good on their strategy by formally transferring her inheritance rights to Gideon in front of Matthias Cooper and the territorial clerk. The actual value being transferred was modest, a few $1,000s in trust funds, some minor holdings, but the symbolic gesture was significant. This feels wrong, Gideon said as he signed the papers. Taking your money. You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you. To us. Marina signed her own name with a flourish. And besides, it's less about the actual assets than about making sure the Valcourts can't use them as leverage. This way, if they do pursue those lawsuits, they'll be pursuing you, and you can tell them to go to hell with my blessing. Cooper witnessed the signatures with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown during their marriage declaration, asking no questions but making sure everything was properly documented. You two are either very clever or very foolish, he observed. Time will tell which. Probably both, Gideon admitted. They returned to the cabin that afternoon to find a second visitor waiting, but this one was welcome. Elizabeth Cooper had ridden out with a basket of food and a warm smile. Heard you two might need some cheering up after yesterday's trouble, she said, unpacking bread, preserves, and an apple pie that smelled like heaven. Also thought Marina might appreciate some female company. Can't be easy being the only woman out here. Marina hugged the older woman with genuine affection. You have no idea how much I appreciate this. Elizabeth stayed for the afternoon, drinking coffee and sharing gossip from Clearwater while deftly teaching Marina small domestic skills, how to make preserves last longer, how to repair torn fabric so the mend was nearly invisible, how to read weather signs in the sky. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming after days of legal threats and emotional intensity. You'll do fine here, Elizabeth told Marina before she left. You've got the right temperament for frontier life, stubborn and adaptable in equal measure. And Gideon's a good man, lost for a while after Sarah, but I think you've helped him find his way back. After Elizabeth rode away, Marina turned to Gideon with a soft smile. I like her. I like the Coopers generally. It's nice knowing we have allies. Frontier takes care of its own, Gideon said. You're one of us now. That means something out here. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm, different from the tentative pattern of Marina's recovery, but no less comfortable. They worked the land together, Gideon teaching her how to read soil quality and plan crops for the following spring. Marina proved surprisingly adept at the practical work, her determination compensating for lack of experience. In the evenings, they talked about the future, what they'd plant, where they might expand the cabin, whether to invest in more livestock. These were the conversations of people building something permanent, putting down roots that went deeper than convenience or necessity. One evening, nearly a month after Hartwell's departure, Marina brought up the subject both of them had been avoiding. Do you think they'll actually leave us alone, or should we be preparing for more trouble? Gideon was whittling a new fence post, and he didn't stop the steady motion of his knife as he considered. Honestly, I think we'll hear from them again. People who construct elaborate legal traps don't usually give up after the first escape. But I also think we've made ourselves significantly less interesting as targets. How so? You're married, your assets are protected, and you've made clear you're not coming back voluntarily. Dragging you back by force would create a scandal, and people like the Valcourts care about appearances. Easier to write you off as a lost cause and focus their energy elsewhere. I hope you're right. Marina was working on a quilt, piecing together fabric scraps into a pattern Sarah had started years ago. Gideon had found it in the trunk of his wife's things, and Marina had asked permission to finish it. He'd agreed, touched by the gesture of connection between the two women who'd shaped his life. Even if I'm wrong, even if they do send lawyers or investigators or whoever else, we'll handle it, Gideon said firmly. You're not alone in this anymore. I know. Marina set down her sewing, moving to sit beside him on the porch. That's still strange to me sometimes. Being part of a we instead of just an I. Good strange, but strange nonetheless. Gideon set aside his whittling and pulled her close. Get used to it. You're stuck with me now. Promises, promises, she teased, but there was warmth in her voice that made his chest tight. The answer to whether the Valcourts would pursue further action came 6 weeks later, delivered by the territorial mail rider who stopped at the cabin with a thick envelope bearing official seals. Marina's hands shook as she opened it, expecting legal threats or demands. Instead, she found a letter from her mother. She's accepted it, Marina said, reading with growing amazement. She says she was angry at first, then worried, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized I'd made the right choice. Tears were streaming down Marina's face now. She's selling the Virginia properties and moving back to her family's home. Says she's sending me her blessing and a small allowance to help us establish our homestead properly. Says she hopes to visit someday, meet the man who gave her daughter the courage to choose her own life. Gideon read over her shoulder, relief flooding through him. What about the Valcourts, the lawsuits? She settled them. Used some of the property sale proceeds to compensate the wagon drivers' families directly, bypassing the Valcourt lawyers entirely. Says Philip was furious, called off the engagement, and announced I had died in the raid. As far as Eastern society is concerned, Lady Marina Valcourt is deceased. Marina looked up at Gideon, her face radiant despite the tears. I'm free. Actually, truly free. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, tasting salt from her tears and joy from her laughter. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Marina was smiling wider than he'd ever seen. We should celebrate, she said. How? I don't know. How do frontier people celebrate good news? Gideon thought about it. Usually involves whiskey and poor decisions. Perfect. Let's do that. They did celebrate, though the whiskey came from Gideon's carefully hoarded supply, and the poor decisions amounted to nothing worse than staying up too late telling increasingly absurd stories and laughing until their sides hurt. It was the kind of simple, genuine happiness that couldn't be bought or forced, only stumbled into when two people found themselves in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The next morning, slightly hungover but thoroughly content, they walked up to Sarah's grave together. Gideon hadn't been there since the day he'd shown it to Marina, but it felt right to visit now, to acknowledge what had ended and what had begun. I'm going to tell her, Marina said quietly. Is that all right? Gideon nodded, stepping back to give her privacy. Marina knelt by the grave marker, one hand resting gently on the weathered wood. Hello, Sarah. I'm Marina. I'm married to your husband now, which I imagine is strange to hear, but I wanted you to know I'm taking good care of him. He's taking good care of me, too. We're building something good here, something I think you'd approve of. She paused, as if listening for a response only she could hear. Thank you for loving him well. It taught him how to love again, and I'm grateful for that. I promise I'll honor what you built here, add to it instead of replacing it. This cabin, this land, it's got room enough for all of our stories. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and Gideon moved forward to stand beside her. Together they looked out over the prairie, watching the wind move through the grass in patterns that looked almost like waves. You think she'd have liked me? Marina asked. I think she'd have loved you, Gideon said honestly. You're exactly the kind of person she respected. Brave, stubborn, unwilling to accept other people's limitations on who you could be. Then I'll do my best to live up to that. They walked back down to the cabin hand in hand, and as they approached, Gideon made a decision he'd been considering for weeks. There's something I want to do, he said. Something symbolic, like your mother's letter releasing you from the past. You interested? Always, Marina said. He led her to the lone cottonwood tree that stood at the eastern edge of his property, the same tree whose branches had caught the sunrise the morning after they'd married. From his pocket, he pulled a small object wrapped in cloth. This was Sarah's wedding ring, he explained, unwrapping it to reveal a simple gold band. I've been carrying it since she died, couldn't quite bring myself to put it away, but I think it's time. Gideon, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I want to. He knelt at the base of the tree, using his knife to dig a small hole in the rich soil. Not because I'm forgetting her, but because I'm making room for the future. For you, for us. He placed the ring in the hole and covered it carefully, patting the earth smooth. Marina knelt beside him, and after a moment's thought, she pulled something from her own pocket. A small jeweled ring, ornate and expensive. "This was supposed to be my engagement ring from Philip," she said. "His family gave it to me when the contracts were signed. I've been carrying it as a reminder of what I escaped, but I don't need that reminder anymore." She buried it beside Sarah's ring, two symbols of old lives laid to rest beneath the cottonwood's spreading branches. "There," she said, standing and brushing off her hands. "Now we're both starting fresh." Gideon pulled her into his arms, holding her close while the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwood's leaves. "I love you," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Should have said it sooner, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Marina Hale." "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I have since you pulled me out from under that wagon and asked no questions. You gave me space to become myself instead of trying to shape me into something you wanted. That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me." They stood there for a long time, holding each other beneath the tree that now held both their pasts. Two people who'd survived loss and betrayal and grief to find something neither had expected. A second chance, freely chosen and dearly held. The seasons turned as they always did, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. Winter came with snow that transformed the prairie into a white ocean, forcing Gideon and Marina to spend long days inside the cabin, which neither minded. Spring followed with its profusion of wildflowers and the backbreaking work of planting. Summer brought heat and the satisfaction of watching things grow. They built additions to the cabin, a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. They acquired chickens, a milk cow, a second horse, so Marina could ride independently. Slowly, carefully, they constructed a life that belonged entirely to them. Matthias and Elizabeth Cooper became regular visitors, along with a handful of other settlers from the surrounding area. Marina proved to be a gifted hostess when the occasion called for it, and their cabin became known as a welcoming place where conversation flowed as freely as coffee. One evening, nearly a year after Hartwell's departure, a stranger rode up to the cabin just as Gideon and Marina were finishing dinner. Both of them tensed. Unexpected visitors still triggered wariness, but this rider was clearly not an investigator or lawyer. She was young, maybe 20, wearing simple traveling clothes and leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. "I'm looking for Marina Hale," the young woman said, dismounting stiffly. "I was told she lives here." "I'm Marina," Marina said, stepping forward cautiously. "Can I help you?" The young woman's face broke into a relieved smile. "My name's Catherine Morse. I'm from St. Louis originally, but I've been traveling west for 3 months trying to get away from a situation similar to what I heard you escaped. Someone in Clearwater told me your story, said you might be willing to help." Marina and Gideon exchanged glances, and something passed between them, a recognition that their story had become something larger than just their own experience. "Of course we'll help," Marina said warmly. "Come inside, tell us what you're running from, and we'll figure out what to do." Catherine burst into tears of relief, and Marina guided her into the cabin with gentle efficiency while Gideon took care of her horses. As he worked, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving, beyond just building a home for two people. They were creating something bigger now, a refuge, a place where people running from lives that didn't fit could find safety and support while figuring out who they wanted to become. Over the next year, Catherine became the first of several women who found their way to the Hale homestead seeking help. Not all of them stayed. Some moved on to California or Oregon. Some returned east after resolving their situation. Some settled in Clearwater or other nearby communities. But all of them left stronger than they'd arrived, carrying the knowledge that freedom was possible if you were brave enough to claim it. Marina organized these efforts with the same determination she brought to everything, creating a network of safe houses and sympathetic allies throughout the territory. Gideon supported her work while maintaining the homestead, and together they built something neither had imagined when they'd first met beneath that burning wagon, a partnership that changed lives beyond their own. 2 years after their marriage, Marina's mother made good on her promise to visit. She arrived in a hired coach, looking every inch the Eastern lady, but with eyes that sparkled with genuine warmth when she saw her daughter. "You look happy," she said, embracing Marina tightly. "Truly happy, not the performing kind." "I am," Marina confirmed. Come inside, meet Gideon properly, see what we've built. The visit lasted a week, and by the end of it, Marina's mother had made peace with her daughter's choices and even begun to appreciate the frontier's strange beauty. On her last evening, she pulled Gideon aside for a private conversation. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing my daughter as a person instead of a prize, for giving her the space to become who she was meant to be. She did that herself, Gideon said. I just provided the location. You provided safety, support, and love. That's considerably more than just a location. She pressed an envelope into his hands. This is the allowance I mentioned, plus some extra. Use it for your work helping other women. Marina's told me about what you're doing, and I want to support it. The money allowed them to expand their efforts significantly, purchasing a second property near Clearwater that could house multiple refugees at once. Marina ran it with help from Elizabeth Cooper and several other women from the community, creating a place where frightened, desperate women could catch their breath and plan their next moves. Gideon watched his wife flourish in this work, saw her transform from someone who'd been running into someone others ran toward. She was magnificent, fierce and compassionate in equal measure, unwilling to let anyone tell her what was possible. One evening, 3 years after their marriage, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Marina's head rested on Gideon's shoulder, her hand in his, both of them quiet and content. Do you ever regret it? Marina asked. Taking me in? Marrying me? All the complications I brought into your peaceful life? Gideon thought about the question seriously, considering the legal threats, the hard work, the constant flow of other people's problems through their home. Then he thought about morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, about Marina's laugh when something genuinely amused her, about the way she fit perfectly against his side. Not even for a second, he said. You brought my life back to me. Everything else was just details. Good answer, Marina said, squeezing his hand, because I'm not going anywhere. Wouldn't let you if you tried. She laughed, the sound warm and free, and Gideon felt gratitude wash over him, not for any dramatic rescue or grand gesture, but for the simple, extraordinary gift of ordinary happiness with someone who understood him completely. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, wild and beautiful and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, more women were planning escapes, gathering courage, preparing to run toward freedom. And here, in this cabin on this hillside, Gideon and Marina would be waiting to help them take those first terrifying steps into new lives. It wasn't the future either of them had imagined. It was better, messier, and more complicated, but infinitely richer for being shaped by choice instead of obligation, by love instead of duty, by the stubborn belief that broken people could help each other heal and build something beautiful from the wreckage of their old lives. As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, Gideon pulled Marina closer and kissed the top of her head. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people seeking refuge, new problems to solve. But tonight, they had this moment, peace and purpose, and the profound contentment of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together, they watched the stars emerge one by one, two survivors who'd found each other in the vast emptiness of the frontier, and discovered that sometimes the best way to heal yourself was to help someone else do the same. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and possibility, and in the warm circle of lamplight spilling from their cabin windows, Marina and Gideon Hale sat together in the home they'd built, ready to face whatever came next. Because that's what marriage meant on the frontier, not just sharing a name or a bed or a piece of land, but choosing each other every single day despite the hardships, despite the uncertainties, despite the world's insistence that some people weren't allowed to write their own stories. They'd written theirs anyway, and it was still being written with every sunrise, every shared meal, every woman who arrived desperate and left empowered. It was a good story, Gideon thought, not perfect, not without pain, but honest and earned and entirely their own. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A life lived on their own terms, with someone who saw them clearly and loved them anyway, building something that mattered in the space between what was and what could be. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, but down here on Earth, in a cabin on the prairie, two people who'd survived the worst and chosen each other, held hands and watched the night deepen, grateful for every moment, ready for whatever tomorrow.